First of all, I would like to, of course, thank the hosts, Diana and her amazing team, for the invitation to join you here in the reuse discussion. And I hope that I can contribute with my presentation. I'm from Sarajevo. Pozdrav svima. But I now live and work in Switzerland, what you can see in this picture. So this is our campus at the ETH of Zurich, which is the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And my first shock when I arrived there was there's agriculture and cows around the super high-tech futuristic campus. So this is a bit the, for me, was the first shock, the notion how Swiss deal with their rural history, which I think in the Balkans we can learn a lot from. But as I know now, it's very unthankful to talk after the lunch break, and lunch break at 4 p.m. That's, I love the Balkans for that. But now I want to wake you up a bit with the collage of sort of impressions from global cities that we did together with the team that I'm involved in called Urban Think Tank at the ETH of Zurich. So I will take you to the global journey across cities with some funky music so you guys can digest a bit faster, and then we can continue with focusing on some of the cities, and then we end the presentation with Sarajevo. So. You heard from the team, that we had a lot of technical problems, so this is one of them. It was working just 2 minutes ago. Come on, give me pictures. Yeah. So please visit the Facebook and the Vimeo and YouTube channel of Urban Think Tank, and you will see a lot more of it. So now I hope that the Burak is a bit more digested after this. So still with, even though we sort of have the global cities approach and we try to sort of connect different countries, being Bosnian guy in Switzerland and making these connections, which I will show in the Sarajevo project later on, you have to still live with cliches. So, but now let's go back to the global stage. As you saw from the pictures, there were impressions from New York, Calcutta, even North Korea, South Africa, Israel, and those are the cities that we somehow involved in different types of research and design. And what we do, and I want to show this here in particular because I think it's great to have many students and young professionals in the audience. So maybe I'm wrong. Students, hands up. Students, people under 30. Now I know how old you are. So I want to devote this presentation and adapt it. This was my goal to the more, and I'm very glad to have the young audience here because this is how we do it for our students at ETH of Zurich, and this is what I do on an everyday basis. We teach those cities, we compile those case studies about really across the globe, from Cairo, Athens, Sarajevo, Zurich, Berlin. We compile them in this sort of we call it a tool. So a tool to teach a student on a particular case study in a particular project. It can be temporary architecture, it can be macro scale planning, it can be a sort of discrete master plan, but we put it in this tool format to teach the students about the whole process of this particular project. So to teach students operatively how these things work or don't work. So we intentionally look also at worst practices, not only the best practices. And this is how it looks like, and I will show you some of the examples further on. So that's we compile it in a toolbox, and look with our students. We we divide everything in 3 different scales. We say, okay, there's a large scale, there's medium scale, and a small scale. We are not the first. We didn't invent it, but our students are most of them in the 2nd year of the bachelor. So we tried to break it down according to the scale, but also break it down according to themes about that focus on the most important global urban challenges today, how we imagine it. So this is how it looks like. So we always present to the students a macro, medium, and macro scale. But we present them what's going on the planet today, and we all know more than 50% people live in cities for the first time in history and all those things. So first, I would say, thesis is we live in a global planet, even in Europe, but of course, if you look around the world at this high pace of urbanization and city growth, we have 100 years ago, 120 years ago, we had just 5 or 6 cities in the world with more than 1 million people. Today, we have a highly urbanized planet. So this is the first claim we do with the students. We also tell our students, look, like never before, everybody's interested in cities and architecture. So like companies, IBM, who suddenly developed something called the Smart City Index. So now the companies who, when I was a kid, I thought they produce keyboards and computers, now they design cities. So and we can go on, and the colleagues who sit here, they know all of those things very well. BMW, aren't they really designing cars or something? But now everybody is somehow interested in what we do. So I think this is an asset for the architecture and urban design students today. The third claim is, and I show it on the example of Switzerland, is it's political. It always has been political, and it's political. So, as you know, Switzerland, besides those cows and cheese, they have referenda. For every major urban intervention, there's a referendum to decide if this, for example, stadium should be built or not. But there's also a larger discussion how, and this is we show to our students, how political it is what they do, and they don't see it in the first glance. They do their beautiful models and renderings. They have all of the softwares in the world. When you tell them, if you go out there, we have to deal with politics. And one of the big referenda lately in Switzerland was to change the spatial planning system completely. And you have all those billboards around town, and then so graphic designers use architecture to show if you vote in favor of this law and this referendum, the density is going to increase in Zurich. So that's the main church in Zurich. And they want to threaten the, let's say, rural tradition of Switzerland, which is showing them sort of Hong Kongish vertical city developments. Another one is Swiss are very proud of the mountains, the Matterhorn, and all those kind of things. And there was another referendum that blocked people for having a second apartment. And again, architecture and urbanism is being used to sort of claim in favor or against of a major change in a society. But it has always been political. Someone was talking about the client and the architect. Architect, client. In this sense, I show this on purpose because the first city we're going to look at is Berlin. We're going to zoom in. Berlin in the 1945, many of you have been to Berlin, and this is what, how Berlin ended up being after the very devastating Second World War. This is the Brandenburg Gate, and that's the Tiergarten, the famous urban forest in Berlin, and this is how it was used in the mid and end of the 40s as a temporary urban agricultural area. So in this sense, how a failed political concept that resulted in destruction of the city and then turned into a very interesting sort of wave of temporary uses until the city was consolidated. So it is political. Again, we have some of the biggest structures in Berlin is the Tempelhof Airport that was closed down. So in the middle of the city, you have 330 hectares of free land now to be used as a recreational area. And what is very interesting is that, you know, all refugee topics, and especially Germany accepted many refugees, is that besides this sort of temporary reuses, or whatever you want to call it, of the outdoor spaces, the indoor spaces are being used now to host refugees of this huge megastructure terminal building. Now we jump to Sao Paulo, one of the cities from the toolbox. As many of you know, this picture shows the social disparities and exclusions and a sort of gated community with beautiful pools, and then the wall, there's a favela. So that's a picture I think everybody knows. But again, we show it to our students to illustrate the sort of global social challenges that are connected with urban development. And in particular tool, we look at urban mobility with students. And this is, we analyze together with them what is the main challenge of mobility in Sao Paulo. So as you can see, average traffic jams are almost 120 kilometers a day. And there was a very interesting fact we figured out is that the people in Sao Paulo spend 36 days per year in a traffic jam. So that's more than they spend being on holidays. So if you have such sort of threatening effect, analyzing cities, then you can look at potential interventions. And what we show to our students is a reuse or the temporary use. I hope I'll get a chance to talk to the colleague from Tirana who showed this fantastic compilation of urban interventions. And this is also similar in Sao Paulo. There are, after a sort of protest of showing, people showing how much car space, how much a place is being taken over by cars and not by pedestrians, it was also resulted into the closure of the highways on Sundays. And then again, it's a colleague of mine, Marcos Rosa, who was doing this research, what happens around those traffic infrastructures, and he realized there's a very active use of this sort of the concept of these non-places. So I think this in the city of Sao Paulo, and this is what we show to our students as a small-scale tool, how to not think as purely as designers, but think as sort of be observers and be moderators of those processes that happen. Detroit, so that's the only, the colleagues who sit in the first row, I think they know the majority of what I'm talking about, but of course, what happened to Detroit is that the first city in the US, a symbol of the American industrial development and growth, had more than 1 million people, the core, the city proper, and then it dropped down under 1 million and was bankrupt. So this American dream of a house and a job sort of was kind of highly shown as a sort of to many people in Detroit as an illusion. And then even Detroit, its destruction that happened through deindustrialization was even that's not a scientific journal, but it being compared to Sarajevo, the space of destruction is being compared to Sarajevo in the 90s. And that's how you see, that's a black plan of the densities, how Detroit from the beginning of the century sort of de-urbanize, ruralize itself. And then, of course, this gives more space to landscape architects. We have some of them here. If you have a sort of the build volume being reduced and you have more free space, that Detroit was turned into a very interesting city lab for research for different types of open space use that was just made available through this deindustrialization. And you can go, that's from the Shrinking Cities book, is the building permits, 3,500 demolition permits, way more. So this is, we showed this to our students to illustrate the urban development in particular context. And this is, if you just zoom out, that's how the core of Detroit looks like, completely urbanized, which again, talking about reuse, those we would say beautiful buildings that are being kind of repurposed, reused as theaters, as parking lots. So, and as well, what I just mentioned is this sort of transformation of open space, and there are loads of projects that look at how can you, hello? Can you hear me? Good. How open spaces can be reused in a different way in a sort of artistic and agricultural projects. And then how this is anticipated and adapted by the politics, as the mayorship of Mayor David Bing, this sort of anticipation, what is really there, sort of this facing with these hard facts of a bankrupt city and taking it into a sort of political reality, turned into a series of master plans or series of, let's say, scenarios developed to improve and sustain the city. And the last stop before we go to Sarajevo is, and Diana, just 10 minutes, when I have 10 minutes left, just raise your hand, okay? Thank you. Then we jump to South America, Caracas, one of the cities you saw in the movie. And this is talking about the modernist housing, real estates, what we have largely and hugely in Europe. This also was a urban reality of Caracas in the end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s, where you had, it's a typical freestanding, if you want to call it super blocks and secondary structures built, and then obviously floating on the lake of open spaces, typical chart of Athens example, and then how this really turned into, and you can see it here, how those open spaces, and that's the building complex called 23 Enero, how this high urbanization rate, remember this globe that I showed, how this affects open spaces in the cities where you have all the public spaces and the open space being, let's say, populated by those settlers who come to live in cities. And this also, and Saskia Saskin wrote about that, this creates a sort of hybrid economic and social networks between those two kind of worlds. And this also doesn't stop just there. It's and I want to show something of what we do, also what we showed at the Biennale in 2012, our team, and it was highly successful. It was this research project, and this is the Torre David. You can Google it, and you read much more about it. I'm not focusing so in detail here, but in this again very rapid urbanization, people started populating and settling into half-finished buildings that again were there because of in this case of a major economic crisis of the 90s, where people just squatted. Squatted is a kind of badly connotated word, but they squatted this building and created a vertical city out of it. And those economic and social mobility flows that were created also together with this sort of settling of people were highly interesting to us, where we analyzed it and look how people really moved through this building. And very interestingly enough, the company Schindler, Schindler Elevators, they were curious to see together with us how a building of 40 stories works without an elevator. So it's a bit of also an interesting paradigm how to try to work with industry partners and other partners, as very often kind of in academia, working with industry partners, it's being regarded as losing your academic integrity and sort of autonomy. but this, in our case, it was a very interesting example. And we also developed a series of potential intervention into this building together with colleagues from building to sustainable building technologies, so all those green building paradigms, as you can imagine. But now I'm coming back home. I'm going to show what we do in Sarajevo. And when I came to Urban Think Tank, I told them, you know what, I can give you the city most similar to Caracas in Europe. That's Sarajevo. And in this sense, we use the Urban Think Tank methodologies and approaches to look at the political, the social, the economic challenges in this sense, and then try to develop potential interventions or at least understand what's going on. And we have, and most of the audience here knows Sarajevo, so I'm not, it's mostly for our colleagues from abroad. So Sarajevo today, if you look at, you know, people know Sarajevo for different reasons, but one of the reasons is this sort of picturesque, beautiful city in the mountains with all those different cultural influences and mountains and the Olympics and all those kind of things. But then if you zoom in, if you go on the street eye scale, what's really there in the city and how to deal with it, of course, a very, very difficult political and economic context of a post-war country. But again, some cliches and stereotypes, Sarajevo, the European Jerusalem, where you have Orthodox churches and Catholic churches and Ashkenazi and Sephardic synagogues and mosques, and just in the same block. So this, and it's true that all of those cultural and ethnic strata, if you want to call it like that, it left the influence in the urban fabric, and that's a fact. But also Sarajevo is known for its complicated history. 1914, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand that led to the First World War. And again, I found it in, there was in the daily, I think in The Guardian, where it's, oh my God, with so things that happened in Sarajevo just started a very bad century, which is unfortunately true. But let's be urbanists and architects. Let's look at what is there. So there's a topography map, and also the map where you can see how Sarajevo developed since its foundation in the 15th century. So you see very dense old city core, typical Ottoman city, with with a highly sort of privatized notion of space, of sort of perception of how and where you spend your time. So you have the Charshia, and then the mahalas around that, around the Charshia. And then in the 19th century with the Austrians, Sarajevo reminds me actually a bit on Innsbruck part. So Sarajevo looks a bit like a sort of middle-sized Austrian city. And then the socialist development, you can see already here in further the valley of the Miljacka River. And this is from an old book, and I couldn't find a better picture. But this shows you, again, the Ottoman Sarajevo, the Austrian, and the early modern and the late modern. So you can really take the tram and go through the city and see little Istanbul, little Innsbruck, and then sort of the typical socialist, modernist urban development. Just from the eye scale, this is the artistic intervention called the Sarajevo Meeting of Cultures. And this is a point where you look to the front and you see this little Innsbruck or Vienna, and you look back and you see the sort of the typical Ottoman urban fabric. And then further on the valley, suddenly you have the socialist city emerging from the landscape. Of course, our friend Le Corbusier was highly influenced many people in Sarajevo, namely, most important is Juraj Neidhardt, who was the first dean of the Sarajevo Architecture School. And he was the student of Le Corbusier, and Le Corbusier also wrote a book of Neidhardt, who was the first master planner of this socialist urban extension of Sarajevo. And this is the first sort of renderings of you see still here, that's the Austrian part, and then the sort of new developments that were published in a book, where also Le Corbusier wrote the pre-word on Neidhardt's ideas of the Bosnian modernism. But Sarajevo was also known for the Olympics, and you can see here the ceremony of the opening in 1984 and all those kind of urban development that came to it. Sarajevo almost doubled its size in the 80s because of this sort of mega event as the Olympics are, and the developments is mostly housing and of course Olympic infrastructure, and then this it's original booklet from the Olympic time in the 80s, and then that's the city where I sort of, when you woke up after this bloody war in the 90s, that's how the city looked like. That's 1996. I was 12 years old, and this is the city where you need to spend your childhood, your teenager years, and your high school and your study, and then you ask yourself, what can I do here in the city? You have to learn how to design nice buildings and master plans and all kind of things, and this was literally almost completely useless for my generation of architects and urban planners. Where you have a city where the public spaces were turned into graveyards, and the people also deurbanized the city themselves, cutting trees to survive. Sarajevo was a very cold city, so Sarajevo lost 300,000 trees. And this also led to the opening of the first landscape architecture program in '96, where people realized Sarajevo is not a green city anymore, so we need to do something about that. So again, the map that shows this beautiful, idyllic, kind of Olympic landscape, and then the city that was under siege, etc. We all know this. And then, but what does it really mean to this architecture? How to reuse this architecture and different other infrastructures that were built for this? So, and this is how the hotels and the skiing facilities look like today. So there's not a big idea how to reuse it. So the ski jumping, it looks like a very post-apocalyptic kind of sad landscape. But then that already triggers extreme sport participants to use it, like we see here, the reuse of the Sarajevo's bobsled today. That's not me, don't worry. But again, what would you do? And then I address you, the audience here, as myself, as a former a young architect and student. How to work in your city, where your city is responsible for the First World War, but then there's a Japanese video game where they put the start of the Third World War, the nuclear breakdown in Sarajevo. So this is that's Sarajevo. So what do you do in the city? And of course, how does it, and my colleagues from the fields of cultural studies analyze how those broken identities, as you can see here, that's the mascot of the Winter Olympic Games next to a humanitarian aid can. So what happens if a city loses its identity? And of course, there are many books written about urbicide, the killing of a city. Bogdan Bogdanovic from Belgrade was on the forefront, but also Marshall Berman, who actually coined the word urbicide in looking at his own home district in Harlem, in New York, how cities kind of dissolve in a particular context. And this can be very easily and seen very well on those before-after images. And that's a photo of Jim Marshall, a friend and colleague who came in 1993 to Sarajevo. And he fell in love with a Bosnian girl, and he stayed until the end of the war in Sarajevo. So guys, be careful with Bosnian girls, okay? They made you stay in the war. And this is Jim 15 years after, in 2012. He went back and that's also nothing new, but it's quite impressive to see this sort of urbicide city and then the city that kind of became normal again. So you have new development, shopping malls, things look the same. Not much has been reused, so office tower, etc. But what's very interesting, and this I show in lectures, is the first time there's a lot of difficult political situations, so the government levels don't really speak to each other. But the first time they met, the president of the country and mayor of Sarajevo was to open the first McDonald's restaurant in Sarajevo. And you can see here, I don't know, the president doesn't look very happy here, but so you can see this sort of typical generic urban development that happens is sort of took its roots in Sarajevo as well. And in 2012, the national government decided to cut completely the funding for the 7 institutions of culture, including the National Museum, the Historical Museum, National Gallery, and there was an artistic action of a colleague and friend, Azra Akshamia from the MIT, who started this action, Culture Shutdown, to make some visibility for this destruction of Bosnian culture, including, of course, then always, if you have such a difficult situation in culture, and I'm coming to this later, how we sort of started working with the Historical Museum of Bosnia, having an online journal where we met with the most relevant cultural workers from Sarajevo and started discussing what are the problems, how to solve it, how can we do something from the point of view of architects and urbanists. And as you can see here, that's the Historical Museum, and I will come to it a lot. You will hear a lot in the last phase of my lecture. And you see it's in a very bad shape. It doesn't have a heating system. The roof is leaking, but you see this kind of new developments emerging, like growing like mushrooms from the grounds around it. So this is, I think, a very emblematic picture of urban development in Sarajevo today. And this is how we started our research project called Reactivate Sarajevo, and tried to look at what is there, what is really there. That's why I call it Reactivate. Sarajevo was an active city, but what can we do for the city today? And we did workshops and conferences, and also we filmed the different versions of movies to show to the world, or sort of as part of a research project, what is happening there in the moment. And what we did, we teamed up with the people from Top Lista and Adralista, because we thought it's the most relevant stakeholders who can tell us about the realities and the futures in Sarajevo. So I will show you now a movie. I hope it works. 8 minutes, and then I have 5 more minutes of talk about sort of a compilation of the urban think tank initiatives there, but also combined with the Top List and Adralista sketches who tell you about. And now the first one you will see, it's about, I would say, urban policy, where that's the hypothetical minister of urbanism in Sarajevo, who's in the interview with a journalist. Later you will see another sketch that talks about the role of the architect that was discussed also highly. But I'll let you watch, and if there is necessity to explain something, I will explain. Who knows Top List and Adralista? Okay. That's the literal translation is the hit list of surrealists. And then many times you hear about those guys being referred as the Monty Pythons of the Balkans. So that's a comedy troupe and a band, music band, Zabra and Pušenje, you know, of course. And they started something in the 80s, which is called and I don't know, Slovenians won't agree, but they call the only authentic subcultural movement in Yugoslavia called New Primitivism, where they really tried to let's say, critically analyze the growing level of primitivism in the Yugoslav society back then. There were then, let's say, the reactions were very diverse, but the most important, I would say, work of them is this TV comedy show that everybody knew that somehow it's being referred as a prediction of the war and all kind of, let's say, unfortunate developments in the 90s in Yugoslavia. So those are the guys who really kind of, and for those interesting for us, how much they look at architecture and architects. And when I talked to Zenit Josic, who's one of the guys who initiated this, he told me, we didn't think of it, but somehow we always ended up criticizing or talking about architecture and architects. So I'll let you watch, and if there are more questions, let me know.
Divlja gradnja je ozbiljan i veliki problem u našoj državi, ali ništa nije, nerješivo.
Kako se vi borite protiv tih negativnih pojava?
760, ali kad zagradi 760, pa ti mene našao levadba, pa gdje je tu računstvo, pa nisam ja levada, iz glave ti to meni, ja sam...
Negotiation about the honorarium.
Ali kad napraviš, baj, svak živ, sad ću se ovako, šta je ovo vikači, ko je ovo napravio?
From Dom za Miješanje, that's the Davor Dujmovic, who unfortunately passed away. And that's Zenit from Top List and Adralista, who also made this movie. And the curly gentleman with the glasses, very sympathetic, that's Professor Brillenburg from...
Profesor iz Urban Think Tanka, moj mentor, kome sam zahvalan na...
But now just come to the last 3 minutes of the lecture. I come back to this museum, you know, and there was a lot of research conducted on Yugoslav modernism and how beautiful it is and how bad it is now. But and I mostly agree with this, and I am really happy to read all the books. But then what you have today is this building, without the sort of proper roof, without the heating system, and falling apart, and being literally on the front line from the war. So the museum was in a no man's land. No Man's Land, the movie. So the museum was between two front lines, between two armies. And this is how it looks like today. So you ask yourself, what can you really do besides of sort of describing what was there in the past? And we went there, and last year and wanted to do a workshop. You realize there's also not a workshop space. So with the first, what we did was literally an illegal intervention to build a space together with local partners from the architecture days to have this. Before after view, to have a sort of small space for projections and workshops that didn't exist in the museum. So I think it's one of the first illegal interventions in the history of national museums in the world. That's what we did. And of course the facade show, which we also did without asking nobody, so we just turned off the street lights, and the US Embassy across the street, the guards, US Marines, were not very happy about, but we still did it. And to make this museum visible in the urban context, as it's really now the pearl of Yugoslav modernism built by Magaš and his team in the beginning of the 60s, and many of you know about this building, but this is the situation where we are facing today there. So, and that's how we decided to have the museum as a first pilot project for our Reykjavik Sarajevo initiative, and then also pulled very quickly a Biennale pavilion this year, and I'm thankful to Diana again and her team for helping with the promotion, visiting us, and being really, really great friends and supporters. And because Bosnia doesn't have a Ministry of Culture, remember, we don't also have a national pavilion. There's no money for that. We receive €0 from the government, so we teamed up with the Bosnian Culture Association from Zurich, from Switzerland, and then had a cultural event at the Biennale. And there was a very interesting, because many countries were focusing on the refugee topic. Germany, for example, if you went to the Architecture Biennale. And then, this Bosnian Swiss Cultural Association is formed by former refugees. So all of the members are former refugees who now sort of want to go back and make this bridge again between, in this case, Switzerland and Bosnia, as you have more Bosnians living abroad than in Bosnia. And we teamed up with them, and also with the support of the mayor of City of Venice, Mr. Brugnaro. We had a beautiful space in Arsenale Nord, and we also did not a very illegal intervention here, so we put our banner together with the construction workers and had for a month a pavilion and events, workshops, and concerts and all kind of activities taking place, discussing with people what can we do with Sarajevo. This is just a few pictures, and I'm coming to the very end of my lecture just to show you the pavilion where there was Bosnia and Sarajevo first time represented ever, and together with the Urban Think Tank and other architect colleagues, Bayer Bischofberger from Switzerland, we sort of started asking these questions about, remember all this, if architecture is political, social, economic, so this is somehow I would say the main skeleton of the Urban Think Tank's philosophy, and this is what we showed in Sarajevo, but also what we showed at the Biennale was colleague Aravena wants fronts, and we lack many things in Bosnia, but we have enough front lines. So what we had is, we showed also the artifacts from the museum, which was the Museum of Revolution, with all the, you have it also in Montenegro, I don't have to go in details, all the pictures and models, celebrating the win against the fascism, but then all those things were just put in the basement in 1996, which are still there, and then the museum became the Museum of the Siege of Sarajevo, and those are the so-called Sarajevo life engineering artifacts of humanitarian aid and cigarettes, which was an informal currency during the war in Sarajevo. It were kind of, out of lack of paper, they were wrapped into textbooks of biology. You see, that's a cell here, and this is a mathematics textbook. So it shows this sort of creativity and inventiveness of people in the middle of the war, which a museum was literally a symbol of the front. And we're very glad about the high level, with the visitor numbers for our event. That's from our opening on 26th of May in front of our pavilion. and I was very happy to explain to something about socialist modernism to a famous colleague who was listening. And also the most, I would say, the central part of our intervention and of our Biennale show was, and it was already mentioned several times, we made this, again, and we didn't invent this, but it was a bit of a very controversially received in Bosnia. We said, okay, the museum, nobody cares for it, the government, it's leaking, we have to protect it. The facade elements are falling apart, so all this sort of this symbol of Yugoslav architecture, modernism is falling apart. And what we did is we created together with, I mentioned, by our Bischofberg architects, we created this sort of skeleton of scaffoldings and a sort of a shrink wrap that should protect the museum from further decay, but also offer temporary spaces for further uses. We will continue doing that. And I hope that many of you will join us for the opening of the exhibition inside the museum on the 23rd of September. Doviđenja u Sarajevu. Hvala vam.